We're here in the townland of Lochty, just outside Kiltyclogher, County Leitrim, at the homestead of Seán MacDiarmada, the second signatory of the 1916 Proclamation. Seán was born here in 1883. He was one of 10 children born to Donald and Mary MacDiarmada. He is widely recognised as one of the principal orchestrators of the 1916 Rising, and for that he has rightfully been bestowed with the title The Mind of the Revolution. According to Seán himself, he was a very mischievous little boy growing up here in Corranmore, and any shenanigans that took place in the area, he was always blamed for them. And now we know he caused a little bit of mischief for the British establishment in 1916. Recollections of Seán from family, friends and comrades paint a picture of a very charismatic, handsome young man with a dynamic and magnetic personality. He's been described as fiery, kind, affable, confident and courageous. A brilliant orator and a natural organiser.
Seán was a small boy and he was in Corranmore school. He was noted by Johnny Mulhern in living memory as sitting in corners and reading books while other children were playing. But if you went near him or annoyed him, he was keen to get up and defend his rights. So Seán, growing up on a tenant farmer scheme, he was keen to learn and went to school and wanted to be a school teacher, but he also wanted to see the whole world. And at 15 he left home and went to Scotland and apparently worked for a turnip farmer first, and then he went abroad again to go to Scotland to his cousins. He moved over to Glasgow, he moved to Belfast. He was also in London, and he even travelled to his brothers and sisters in Brooklyn in America. So it was easy to go from here. Even as rural as this is, it's only 25 minutes to Glenfarne, where the railway station had been built by Lord Tottenham.
Seán was born within living memory of the famine and in the wake of a series of really ruthless evictions carried out by the local landlord here, Arthur Loftus Tottenham. No doubt he grew up hearing accounts of these atrocities, which occurred in 1881 when Ireland was in the throes of the land war, spearheaded by Michael Davitt and Charles Stewart Parnell. At this stage was studying to be a national school teacher and was working as a monitor at Corranmore National School, which he had attended himself. This plan didn't work out, and history would have been very different perhaps if it did, because at this stage Seán's life took a path towards realising his nationalist aspirations. After a short spell working in Edinburgh, he returned to Ireland to study business and Irish under the tutorage of Master McGurn in Tullamore National School near Dara in West Cavan. It's up here we believe that Seán became more radicalised, even though he was already very patriotic, as we know. But a fellow pupil of Seán said, "McGurn made rebels of us all."
The colonies are very useful to a country in many ways. The English colonies are very numerous and powerful. They can boast of having large possessions, but let them never boast of having honourably won them. They cannot say they ever won a single battle of themselves. Without the aid of Irishmen, or even with their help, they have to use their treachery, sometimes in bribing their enemies. However, this does not come under the above heading, and I must let it be for the present. Seán MacDiarmada, 14th of January 03. That's why we would think he was already being radicalised by many things. Between the whole evictions, the whole history was still raw, the famine was still raw. His father's love of Ireland, he was member of the IRB, he had moved on. But Seán's notoriety was becoming very, very big.
He became further politicised when he moved to Belfast in 1905 and fell into the company of two young men his own age, John Bulmer Hobson and Dennis McCullough. they had just started an organisation called the Dungannon Club. And this, I suppose, could best be described as a sister organisation of the IRB, in that they both had the same principal aim to achieve an independent Ireland by physical force if necessary. Seán was introduced to Hobson as a promising young fellow from the country, and this promise certainly held true. Hobson said he brought a sincerity and energy to the organisation that made him a very valuable recruit. Under Hobson's mentoring, Seán became a very accomplished public speaker. When the Dungannon Club started spreading their Republican gospel, originally they were met with derision and hostility, and they were often met with bricks and stones and constant jeering. But this is where Seán's fearlessness and fiery temperament came to the fore. He was really quick-witted and really adept at handling hecklers, and very soon the crowds were actually calling for the young fella from the country with the fiery tongue. And within a few short years, he was a national organiser for the IRB, a national organiser for Sinn Féin, manager of the IRB newspaper Irish Freedom, secretary of the Supreme Council of the IRB, and ultimately he was a founder and member of the military council that planned and drove the rising. One of Seán's most significant contributions to the rising was the efforts he put into strengthening and reorganising the IRB as an organisation. Particularly between the years 1908 and 1910, he travelled the country swearing in new members, many of these who would become very notable figures in the 1916 Rising and the War of Independence, and unfortunately the Civil War. Brian Feeney, in his biography of Seán, says it's no exaggeration to say that Seán single-handedly reorganised the IRB from the grassroots up.
His organising of Sinn Féin, and he arrived in Dublin and met a really great friend, which was Thomas Clarke. And he met Thomas Clarke, and they both worked in D'Lear Street at one stage, including Min Ryan from Cummin so it was quite a hive of activity in 12 D'Lear Street. Seán was the business manager of the Irish Freedom paper. This was like, it was like the political wing of Sinn Féin as well, was using this as propaganda for what its agenda was. Seán's notoriety was becoming bigger and bigger, and he was on his way from the cradle to the grave to becoming one of Ireland's national heroes, and is within that Irish national crown, he's one of the brighter jewels in that historic crown. He gave his life and sacrificed his whole life from child to death. He definitely was a single-minded person in what he wanted to do. He had worked in Dublin, and then he had worked towards what they called the Emmet celebration, which was another name, the code name for the Rising. And we've many letters in our Heritage Centre showing this. He moved on, but at the time polio was a very big plague in Ireland at the time, and many people were afflicted with this illness, and Seán too was. So as good looking and charismatic and amicable as he was from County Leitrim and coming up, he had this ailment, but he used it in a jovial way and a manners, and he would joke about his leg, and his leg being a limp that he took with him into the GPO in 1916. And he was part of the two gun runnings that occurred when Ireland needed to bring weaponry to the Irish volunteer force, which was now volunteers, which was now organised by Seán, was a founding member, and himself and Owen MacNeill organised an army to face its foe. And this occurred only a bit too late did they find out when Roger Casement's attachment of arms were caught on the Odd. But prior to that, there was two successful landings, one in Kilcool and one in Howth. And Seán was involved with both of these landings. And there's a great account you can read from Anna Fahy, who seems to be a great fan, and Frank Fahy were also volunteers that had worked on the Kilcool land, and there's great accounts you can find in the eyewitness accounts, all over the internet or anywhere. And Seán's recognition is only coming to date, really, of what he had achieved as an organiser and as his life sacrifice that he had given from as a child who walked to school in his bare feet over the bog, to Corranmore school, to standing on top of the GPO with the tricolour furling away in the background. It was some surprise after 6 days of fighting in Dublin, and the garrison of the GPO was the only garrison that actually surrendered during 1916 Rising. It was the only one that surrendered. It went on fire with the blazing of the Helga incendiaries that were coming up through the Liffey, and that story of the Helga coming up through the Liffey is really where you get that song, famous song, The Foggy Dew. And so it all ties in with this, like Seán's history and his life from County Leitrim really shows a great historic world that Ireland went through, and it's pledged to be a sovereign state. He had given up on many things like home rule a good bit back when it was reneged 3 times. Gladstone had even given the people of Ireland a gold lapel in congratulating Ireland on its addition to home rule in the empire. But this was not to happen. And some people say that the 1916 Rising and Seán's role was really the crack in the British Empire, which eventually fell apart, and many other countries followed the conditions of the 1916 Rising and had the same reasons politically and socially to escape British colony. India was one, a definite country that followed up and had women in its army as well. And Cumann na mBan, you wouldn't be able to have a 1916 Rising without Cumann na mBan. And there was 3 sections in Cumann na mBan that were of great notoriety. And we have some great illustrations in our books as well up here in the cottage to show all those women that had fought or endured the British rule. Some of them were nurses, some of them were dispatch girls, and some of them were snipers. And they all were accounted for in the 1916 Rising. There seemed to be like a triage of, say, the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Citizen Army, and Cumann na mBan. And there was those after Owen MacNeill had put out the orders to actually call off the Rising, and it was told to be called off. Even Min Ryan, Seán's girlfriend and betrothed, had gone to give the orders to actually cancel the Rising. Seán was furious at this, and so were the rest of the IRB council members, and they met immediately, and Thomas Clarke said they would have it. The Rising would go ahead on, and it would go ahead on, I think it was the Sunday. They decided to go ahead and have it as its natural go ahead, even though it was called off. They had enough members between Cumann na mBan, Irish Citizen Army, and some of the volunteers to go and do what they had wanted to succeed. And what had they wanted to succeed? Well, this is interesting. They wanted to hold the place as a defence. That's why there was garrisons all around Dublin. They wanted to defend it for 5 to 6 days. And they knew at the end of the Great War that was rising in the background between the Germans and the British and the Allies and the Italians and all that was going on, that there was going to be a sit down at the end of all this, and that Ireland would be able to go to the League of Small Nations and vouch for its own sovereignty. So having an army on the streets, while it suited those 3 factions that were mainly there. It's the women who were looking for their rights as women's rights, to have equal rights as men, which was seen in the proclamation as the opening line is Irish men and Irish women. The Irish Citizen Army, who were fighting for Ireland's workers' rights. And this was to the background of the ITGWU, the national lockout that was occurring on the streets at the time, and riots were rampant. and workers were without food and they were starving. So this was another background that was going on to a great history of the Great War. And then you had the Irish volunteers who were vouching to also not only take over Ireland and become a government and govern Ireland, but they were also to protect Ireland as well. So these were the main factions that occurred during 1916. And Seán, to stand up on top of the GPO with Garóid O'Sullivan, his aide-de-camp, putting up the tricolour. Now the tricolour was something associated to Seán, and even goes back to when Sinn Féin had their first by-election in Leitrim. They came down with a local band from Glenkeel who came down with a big bass drum and many instruments and played ahead of this new Sinn Féin, which had already clad themselves in green, white and gold. Now, the flag that the Proclamation was telling its children to rise to was a very different one. And some say it was left in Liberty Hall and wasn't brought down by the main forces. It was a green flag with a harp, and this was supposed to be the supposedly national flag of Ireland. But instead we have a tricolour, which Garóid O'Sullivan put up under the orders of Seán MacDiarmada on the GPO. After the GPO was on fire, they had to evacuate, and evacuation plans were made, and they went down through Moore Street, but they went through the buildings from Henry Street and broke through each walls and eventually halted up in number 16. Famous number 16, Moore Street, which people are still fighting for to keep it as a national building today. But outside apparently was the O'Reilly's men who had charged in a valiant effort to save the GPO volunteers, but had sadly been gunned down. Many victims of the 1916 Rising were also civilians, and civilians were amongst these casualties and deaths that were in front of them. And I suppose the Supreme Council or the IRB decided we had enough. We had our 6 days and we could go to the League of Nations. Let's surrender. But this didn't go well with the Irish volunteers, especially the ones that were in the GPO, and they felt that they were going to fight on, and they were very disappointed that the rising was being called off. And so Pearse wrote a surrender letter and read it out to them, but nobody wanted to have it. But Seán walked in and he placated the men and told them, I'll tell you what's going to happen. We're going to be executed. So he's quite prophetic in his own rights, you know. He said, we're going to be executed, but yous will live on to carry this on. Let us go ahead. And so they went ahead with Seán's words, and it would be Volunteer Joe Good, which you can see on RTE, says that Seán led them out with a white flag, and they went and they landed onto Sackville Street, which was O'Connell Street, and they decommissioned their arms there. But that was prior to the valiant efforts of Elizabeth Farrell, who went down twice to the British leaders to actually surrender on behalf of the rebels. And she was told to go and fetch a man. She went back and took Pádraig Pearse, but they actually erased her from history, but they left her feet in the picture by mistake, and we have a recollection of her now in that picture. When they arrived on the streets, well, it was all gung-ho from these young British soldiers that had arrived over and offered them chocolates and cigarettes and said, you put up a great fight. And so a lot of the people intermingled, and some men were on both sides. Some men were in the British Army and some men were actually in the rebel forces. And brothers often met and exchanged greetings and hugged. At this moment, things looked to be going well, but this was not to go so well. When the forces of the British came along and there came the more the officers arrived, they broke up any conversations between any men's or anything like that. And in fact, they put the whole crowds all around the Rotunda Hospital, and they had to spend the whole night there. And there's even rumours, and even said that a couple of them were stripped, including Seán MacDiarmada and Thomas Clarke, and some nurses were stripped too. And they were told that he started to be jeered by some of the British leaders, saying that he was a cripple and do Sinn Féin take cripples in their army and the likes of this. They were then marched down to Richmond Barracks, where they stayed in Richmond Barracks. Seán had to be escorted by himself because of his limp. They were jeered and booed, and there was stones and all sorts of things thrown at them as they went through the streets of Dublin. They arrived in Richmond Barracks, but they felt victorious, and they looked outside the windows. And according to O'Brien and a few of the other volunteers, they said that they looked happy enough at what they had done. Seán was standing at the window, and he recalled saying, "I wonder if the Germans will bring their promise and land in Galway and send their platoon in. That would really shock them." And everyone laughed. And what was really surprising was that one of the volunteers had a cigar, and they sat and they had a powwow, and they passed the cigar around to each other, from Plunkett to Pearse to Seán MacDiarmada. But Thomas Clarke got the first, was handed the cigar first. And it was the first time when I ever read anything was in a book by O'Brien on insurrection. And it did state that Thomas Clarke said, he said, "Oh, gee, that's one hell of a cigar." And the first time I realised he had an American accent. And so this brought more colour to me, to the people of 1916, and Seán laughed. And Seán showed his friendship with Thomas Clarke and the others, that they were all very amicable and friendly to each other. The 1916 rising prisoners, or heroes, whichever you want to call them, arrived into Kilmainham, and they were court-martialed after a trial. A short trial. Some say it was like a kangaroo court and it wasn't fair. But whatever happened, they were picked out and they were killed after 3 or 4 days, the first executions. They were lined up in the stonebreaker's yard at sandbags, and they were shot one by one. Asquith, the British Prime Minister, had come over, and there was a cessation to the actual killings. And even during that period of time, Seán had met up with Min Ryan, and the Capuchin monks had prepared him. And Father Eugene McCarthy prepared him for his death. And he gave a statement to Min Ryan, MacDiarmada's sweetheart, that was his girlfriend. And he said, "Seán MacDiarmada, before paying the penalty of death for my love of country and hatred of our slavery, desire to leave this message to my fellow countrymen. That I die as I have lived, bearing no malice to any man, and in perfect peace with Almighty God. The principles for which I give my life are so sacred that I now walk to my death in the most perfectly calm and collected manner. I ask the Reverend Eugene McCarthy, who has prepared me to meet my God, and who has given me courage to undergo this ordeal, to convey this message to my fellow countrymen. God save Ireland." He not only wrote this statement, he also wrote a last letter to his family. But he met his girlfriend and the Capuchin monks and Father McCarthy, and eventually it was getting close to time for Seán's own death, and he was killed on the 12th of May at 3:45 with James Connolly. Some say James was in a chair, and some say he was in a stretcher. Seán's cane was taken away from him, and Seán, in his last words, said to the firing squad that looked straight at him, he took off his blindfold and he faced his fears with his eyes open, and he said, "I die that Ireland may live." And they were his last words. And he was taken off with James Connolly, and they were put in a truck, and they were sent down to Arbour Hill to be limed so nobody could exhume the bodies or make heroes of them in Ireland.